To the outside world, my father was a good man. That's the version they printed in the Globe and Mail business section 3 years running. That's the version his colleagues toasted at charity galas in downtown Toronto. That's the version my mother believed, or chose to believe, right up until the night she didn't. I was 22 years old the evening. Everything I thought I knew about my family got folded up and thrown in the trash like a gas station receipt. It was a Thursday in November, the kind of cold that doesn't just chill you, it gets inside your coat, inside your bones, inside your chest and sits there. My younger brother Theo had driven up from Guelph that morning. He'd taken time off from his job at the warehouse because our mother had called him crying and he hadn't been able to make out most of what she was saying. That scared him more than anything else could have. I met him on the front steps of our house in Oakville. He looked at me and I looked at him, and neither of us said anything for a moment. We'd grown up in that house. Our grandfather, who we called Papa Lorne, had helped our father buy it when Theo and I were still small enough to sit on his shoulders. I used to run my hand along the wooden railing of the front porch and feel like I lived somewhere permanent, like we were the kind of family things didn't happen to. That Thursday evening, things happened to us. My father was already in the living room when we went inside. He was standing with his back to the fireplace in the way he always did when he wanted to look larger than he was. Shoulders squared, chin slightly lifted, like he was about to address a boardroom. My mother was sitting on the couch with both hands wrapped around a mug she wasn't drinking from. I noticed her eyes were dry. She'd already finished crying. He didn't wait for us to take off our coats. "I need you both to understand," he said, "that what I've built, the firm, the properties, the reputation, I've built it my way. And I'm not going to allow either of you to put that at risk." I didn't understand what he was talking about. I said so. That was my mistake. He turned his eyes on me with a look I'd never seen from him before. Not anger exactly, but something colder than anger. Something deliberate. He told me that he'd heard what I'd been saying. About the Whitmore account. About the discrepancy I'd noticed in the quarterly filings when I'd done a brief stint at his firm the previous summer. He said I'd been talking to people I shouldn't be talking to, asking questions that weren't mine to ask. He was right. I had been asking questions. I had been talking to a compliance officer I'd met through a friend. Nothing formal, nothing official. Just, something hadn't sat right with me and I hadn't been able to leave it alone. He told me that as of that night, I was no longer his son, not in the way that mattered. He said he'd already revised his will, and that both Theo and I should make arrangements to vacate the family property by the 1st of the month. He said this the way he would have said he was canceling a subscription. My mother didn't look up from her mug. Theo made a sound beside me. A quiet, short sound. Not a word. Not quite. We left. I drove. I don't remember most of the drive, except for the highway lights and Theo's silence in the passenger seat, and the feeling that the car itself was somehow smaller than it had been an hour ago. We ended up at a Tim Hortons because I didn't know where else to go, and I needed something in my hands. We sat across from each other in a booth under the fluorescent lighting, and I watched my brother stir cream into his coffee for about 2 minutes without saying anything. "So," he finally said. "Yeah," I said. That was the whole conversation for a while. I thought about calling someone. I went through a short list in my head of people who might know what to do and came up empty, because this wasn't the kind of situation anyone had a script for. What do you say? My father just disowned us because I noticed something in a spreadsheet and couldn't pretend I didn't. It was Theo who remembered the property up north. He brought it up carefully, like he wasn't sure if it was real or something he'd half-invented from childhood. Papa Lorne had owned a piece of land outside of Huntsville, maybe 40 minutes from the town itself, up a logging road that turned to gravel and then to dirt. There was a building on it. A workshop, really, though Papa Lorne had sometimes called it his study. He'd been an engineer before he retired, and he'd spent his last working years designing things he didn't tell anyone about. He died when I was 15, and I hadn't thought about that property in years. But Papa Lorne had given me something on his last Christmas, a key on a plain ring, old and heavy, with a piece of white tape wrapped around the bow. He'd pressed it into my hand at the door when we were leaving for the night and said, very quietly so that no one else heard, "You'll know when." I'd kept it in a box in my closet for 7 years. I knew exactly where it was. We drove north that same night. I don't know what made us do it immediately, some combination of having nowhere else to go and not being ready to sit still. The 400 was quiet past midnight, and the sky over Muskoka was completely clear. The kind of clear that only happens in November when the tourists are gone and the lakes are going still. Theo slept for part of the drive. I kept the radio off. The logging road was harder to find than I expected. We'd been up there once as kids for a fishing weekend, and I'd spent most of it trying not to get my feet wet. My memory of the route was impressionistic at best. We turned down 2 wrong roads before the headlights caught the gate. A heavy steel frame set between 2 cedar posts, secured with a padlock that had rusted orange around the shackle. Theo stood beside me while I tried the key. My hands were cold and I fumbled it twice. On the 3rd try, something gave. The padlock clicked open and dropped into my palm. We looked at each other. "Okay," Theo said. "Okay," I agreed. The path beyond the gate was overgrown but passable, the gravel long since pushed into the grass by frost and thaw cycles over 7 winters. The building was at the end of it, a low, wide structure that looked more solid than I remembered. Concrete foundation, cedar plank walls, a metal roof that had gone gray. Papa Lorne had built it in sections over about a decade, and it showed there was a precision to the original structure, and then additions that were more practical than elegant, the marks of a man who revised as he went. Inside it smelled like cedar and old paper and something faintly mechanical, machine oil maybe, from the tools hanging along one wall. A workbench ran the length of the far wall. There was a wood stove in the corner, and a cord of firewood stacked beside it, which seemed impossible until I realized he must have paid someone local to maintain it. A small generator sat just inside the door, and on the workbench, weighted down by a wrench, was an envelope with my name on it. I stared at it for a long moment before I picked it up. Papa Lorne had written 4 pages in the careful, small handwriting he used when something mattered to him. He'd written them, based on the date at the top, 8 months before he died. He told me he loved me first, and he told me he loved Theo second, and then he told me what he knew. He knew about the Whitmore account. He knew about accounts that predated the Whitmore account, smaller ones, transactions that went back 15 years to when my father was still building his firm from a suite of offices on Bay Street. Papa Lorne had been a silent investor in those early years, early enough to have access to certain records, early enough to have started noticing certain patterns. He wrote that he hadn't known what to do with what he'd found. He was old, and he was tired, and my father was his daughter's husband and the father of his grandchildren. He wrote, "I told myself I'd made a mistake. I told myself that several times. I'd always been good at telling myself things, but he hadn't destroyed the records. He'd kept them, organized them, added to them over years. They were in a fireproof lockbox bolted to the floor of the workshop, accessible through a panel beneath the workbench. The combination was the year he immigrated to Canada, followed by the year I was born. He wrote that he didn't know what I would face when I finally needed to open that lockbox. He wrote that he hoped I'd never need to. He wrote that if I was reading this letter, it probably meant I did. You are more honest than you know how to be comfortable with, he wrote. That's going to cost you something, but it's also the only thing that saves people in the end. I sat on the floor of my grandfather's workshop and read that letter twice. Theo sat on the edge of the workbench with his arms crossed, watching me, waiting. When I finally looked up, he said, "Well?" "He knew," I said. "Knew what?" "Everything." The lockbox was exactly where Papa Lorne had described it. The panel beneath the workbench lifted on hinges that had been oiled recently enough that they moved without resistance. Another thing he must have arranged before he died. The box itself was gray steel with a combination dial on the front, and when I entered the numbers and turned the handle, it opened cleanly. What was inside looked, at first, like ordinary paperwork. Folders, accordion files, a USB drive taped to a piece of cardboard with a typed label. But the further I looked, the clearer it became. There were account statements showing capital moved through a numbered company in Alberta, a shell that had no staff, no offices, no function except to receive and forward funds. There were invoices from contractors who, Papa Lorne had noted in the margins, had never existed. There were loan documents from a federally regulated institution with signatures on them that Theo and I both recognized immediately, attached to businesses that had filed for insolvency within 18 months. Mortgage fraud, wire fraud, at a scale that had apparently persisted, in various forms, for over a decade. My father hadn't just bent a few rules. He'd built an entire architecture around bending rules, an infrastructure of shadow companies and compliant professionals and willful blindness. And at the center of all of it was something Papa Lorne had quietly documented, folder by folder, year by year, without ever saying a word to anyone. We spent 3 days in that workshop. We used the generator and the wood stove, and we ate from the grocery store in Huntsville, and we went through every document twice. I took photographs of everything with my phone. Theo organized the folders by date. We didn't talk much during those days in the way that brothers don't always need to. We understood what we were doing and we understood what it meant. On the 4th night, I called my friend from university, whose older sister was a lawyer in the white-collar practice of a firm in Ottawa. I told her I needed to speak to someone, and I needed it to be someone I could trust. She called me back within an hour. The lawyer's name was Rosalind, and she was calm in the way that people who have heard a lot of bad things become calm. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a brief pause, and then she said, "Don't move anything. Don't destroy anything. Don't talk to your father. Give me 48 hours. She called back in 36. She had been in contact, she said carefully, with someone at the Financial Crimes Enforcement Division of the RCMP. She had not disclosed my name yet, but she had described the nature of the documentation, and she had been told that if it was as I described, it was significant. She asked me if I was prepared for what came next. I looked at Theo across the workbench. He was watching me steadily. He gave me a small nod. "Yes," I said. What came next moved faster than I expected and slower than I wanted, which I've since been told is standard. The documentation was surrendered to federal investigators over the course of 2 meetings in which Rosalind sat beside me and told me when to speak and when not to. The USB drive Papa Lorne had left turned out to contain records that predated the paper files, correspondence, scanned checks, digital versions of contracts that certain parties had apparently believed were lost. An investigator told me, in a tone that was carefully neutral, that they had been looking for a thread into this particular network for some time. The charges came 5 months later. My father was arrested on a Tuesday morning outside the building in Toronto, where his firm still operated. The story was on CBC that afternoon and in the Toronto Star the next morning. There were 17 counts: wire fraud, mortgage fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud. One of his longest-standing business partners, a man named Roderick, who I remembered from childhood as always having a very expensive watch, was arrested the same week. I heard about the arrest from Rosalind before it happened. I was sitting in the workshop when she called. I'd gone back up to Huntsville because it was the only place I could think clearly. After I hung up the phone, I sat for a long time looking at my grandfather's workbench. The wrench that had been holding down the envelope was still there. I'd moved it off when I opened the letter and then set it back, automatically, where it had been. It was old, pitted with use, with masking tape wrapped around the handle, the way Papa Lorne always did with his tools so he could identify them. I thought about the last time I'd seen him. He'd been thin by then. The illness had moved fast in his last months, and he'd sat in the kitchen at the family house in a flannel shirt with his hands around a cup of tea and told me about a bridge he'd helped design in his 3rd year as an engineer, somewhere in the interior of BC. He said the thing he'd been proudest of was not the design itself, but the fact that when they ran the load tests, the numbers came back almost exactly as he'd calculated. "You do the work right," he said, "and the numbers don't lie to you. He'd spent the last years of his life doing work he hoped he'd never need to use. But he'd done it right. Theo and I were named as cooperating witnesses in the federal investigation. Rosalind told us that in cases of this nature, individuals in our position were sometimes eligible for consideration under the RCMP's whistleblower framework. There was no guaranteed financial outcome, but given the scale of the fraud and the quality of the documentation, she thought it was worth pursuing formally. It took another 14 months, during which I worked at a logistics company in Hamilton, and Theo finished his apprenticeship, and we both learned to talk about our father in the past tense. The civil settlement, separate from the criminal proceedings, included a provision for cooperating witnesses that Rosalind had negotiated with a patience that I will spend the rest of my life being grateful for. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough for Theo to make a down payment on a townhouse in Cambridge and for me to finish the accounting designation I'd put on hold. My father was convicted on 11 of the 17 counts. He's currently serving a sentence at a federal institution in Ontario. He did not look at me during the trial. I sat 2 rows behind the Crown's table, and I watched the back of his head, and I thought about a lot of things. But mostly I thought about my grandfather, who had been a quiet, precise, deeply private man who kept his tools organized and his records accurate, and who had loved his grandchildren enough to spend the last years of his life building them something they would need. There is a kind of inheritance that doesn't look like anything from the outside. It doesn't come with a reading of a will or a lawyer's call or any of the things you imagine when you're young and you think about what people leave behind. It comes with a key on a plain ring and 8 words said quietly at a door. You'll know when. My grandfather was right. I knew. A few months ago, I drove back up to Huntsville by myself on a Saturday in late September, when the maples along the 11 were doing the thing they do, and the whole highway looked like it was on fire in the best possible way. I unlocked the gate with the same key. I went inside the workshop and I stood at the workbench for a while. I'd had the building assessed and it's structurally sound. Good concrete, good bones, the way Papa Lorne built everything. I'm going to keep it. I'm going to take care of it the way he took care of it. I'm going to stack the wood stove in the winter and oil the hinges and replace the bits of weather stripping that have started to crack along the east-facing door. It's the least I can do for a man who, when the world told him to look away, chose instead to write everything down and trust that one day someone with enough honesty and enough nerve would know what to do with it. He believed my life was worth saving before I knew I needed saving. That is the only inheritance that has ever mattered.